The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Lieutenant Masaru Tanaka's wrists as he stood on the deck of the American transport ship. Salt spray stung his face, the Pacific wind carrying the scent of defeat. Around him, dozens of other Japanese soldiers swayed with the rolling waves, their uniforms stained with blood and sweat, their expressions vacant. Captivity had seemed impossible just weeks earlier as they fought desperately on Saipan. Now they were cargo, human freight bound for American shores. The guards watched impassively, rifles at the ready, as the prisoners whispered among themselves about what awaited them. The propaganda had been clear. Capture meant torture, humiliation, death. Some had already attempted suicide rather than face such dishonor. Tanaka kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, remembering the instructions from his commander. Reveal nothing, resist everything. Die with honor if necessary. "They will break your body," his captain had warned. "Then they will break your spirit." The Americans would extract information through brutal means. This was what they had all been told. As the California coastline emerged through the morning mist, Tanaka steeled himself for the horrors to come. He had watched comrades die in the surf, seen flesh torn by machine gun fire. He could endure whatever torments these barbarians had planned. The processing began with mechanical efficiency. American soldiers herded the prisoners down gangplanks, through checkpoints, into waiting trucks. Names were recorded, photographs taken, numbers assigned. There was no beating, no screaming, just the methodical documentation of captured enemies. This itself was unsettling. The quiet order contradicted everything they had expected. The trucks rumbled inland, away from the coast, through landscapes of impossible abundance. Orchards stretched to the horizon. Fields of grain rippled in the breeze. Even in wartime, America seemed untouched by scarcity. When they arrived at the camp, high fences topped with barbed wire confirmed that this was indeed prison. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, rifles visible in silhouette. The Japanese soldiers filed through the gates in silence, eyes downcast, prepared for the worst. Inside, they found rows of wooden barracks, clean latrines, a mess hall. Medical personnel examined them for injuries and disease. Those with wounds received treatment. Those with lice were deloused. Again, the absence of cruelty was disorienting. That first night, as Tanaka lay on his assigned bunk staring at the ceiling, a sound drifted through the camp that made him sit upright in shock. It was music, not recorded, but live. The notes of a violin floated on the evening air, joined moments later by a clarinet, then a cello. He moved to the window, peering into the gathering darkness. There, in a circle of electric light near the center of the camp, sat 4 American soldiers with instruments in hand, playing what sounded like Mozart. "Impossible," Tanaka whispered, his breath fogging the window glass. The music continued, delicate and precise, as if the barbed wire and guard towers were merely an illusion. As if this were not a prison camp, but a concert hall. As if they were not enemies, but audience members. He stood transfixed, listening until the final notes faded into the California night. It was the first indication that captivity would be nothing like the death sentence they had been promised, nothing like the stories they had been told. The music was only the beginning. Morning revealed the camp in full daylight, an ordered grid of buildings surrounded by the Sierra Nevada mountains. The prisoners assembled for roll call, standing at attention as they had been trained. Many expected punishment drills to follow, perhaps forced labor under the desert sun. Instead, after their numbers were confirmed, the American commander addressed them through an interpreter. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will receive 3 meals daily. You will have access to medical care. You will not be harmed unless you attempt escape." The words seemed hollow, a prelude to some cruel joke. Yet as the days passed, the promised treatment materialized. The food, while strange to Japanese palates, was plentiful, more than many had received in their own army. Clean water flowed from taps. Showers were available weekly. The guards maintained discipline, but rarely shouted, never struck prisoners. It was as if they were determined to demonstrate something beyond mere confinement. Most baffling of all was the music. Every evening, weather permitting, American soldiers would gather with instruments. Sometimes just 3 or 4, occasionally a dozen or more. They played classical pieces, jazz standards, folk tunes. For men raised in Japan's strict military culture, where every activity served a purpose, this seemed wasteful, even decadent. What army would allow its soldiers to spend precious wartime hours playing violins and trumpets? Private Kenji Yamamoto, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Navy, confided to Tanaka during work detail, "I was trained to believe Americans were undisciplined barbarians, but these men, they play Bach with the precision of Tokyo Conservatory students." Tanaka nodded silently, unwilling to admit how the music had affected him. Each night, he found himself listening for those first notes, feeling something hard within him soften just slightly when they came. 1 week into their captivity, an American sergeant appeared at the barracks door with an unexpected question. "Any musicians among you?" the interpreter translated. The prisoners exchanged wary glances. Was this a trick? A way to identify the educated for special interrogation? After a long silence, Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura raised his hand tentatively. "I played violin at university," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The sergeant smiled. "We're short a violinist. Would you like to join this evening?" The question hung in the air like a mirage, something impossible that nevertheless existed. Nakamura looked to his fellow prisoners for guidance. Tanaka, the highest-ranking officer present, gave a slight nod. What harm could come from learning more about their captors? Besides, playing music was hardly collaboration with the enemy. That evening, under the watchful eyes of guards and prisoners alike, Nakamura joined the American musicians. His hands trembled as he accepted a loaned violin, tested its strings, and took his place in the circle. The first few notes he played were hesitant, uncertain. But as the piece progressed, Vivaldi's Spring, his confidence grew. The music spoke a language that required no translation, needed no diplomatic clearance. For 15 minutes, he was not a prisoner, but a musician, creating something beautiful amidst the ugliness of war. When the piece ended, silence hung in the air for several heartbeats before both American and Japanese listeners applauded. Nakamura bowed formally, then returned the violin. As he walked back to the barracks, his posture seemed different, straighter, more dignified. He had expected to die for his emperor. He had never expected to play Vivaldi for his enemies. Throughout the camp, the evening's performance sparked whispered conversations. If the Americans allowed this small dignity, what did it mean? Was it a psychological tactic, a way to lower their guard before interrogation began? Or was it something else entirely? A glimpse into a military culture so fundamentally different from their own that it could spare attention for beauty, even in wartime. The questions multiplied as days stretched into weeks. More prisoners revealed hidden talents. A shakuhachi flute player, a former kabuki drummer, a baritone who had once considered an opera career before the war intervened. The evening music sessions grew, sometimes featuring Japanese instruments alongside Western ones, creating strange hybrid melodies that had never before existed. For Tanaka, watching from a distance, it was both fascinating and troubling. The sounds drew him in, reminded him of concerts in Tokyo before the war. Yet he resisted participating, viewing the musicians with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Those who played returned to the barracks with flushed faces and animated conversation. They seemed momentarily freed from the shame of capture. This worried him. Captivity should remain a burden, not become a respite. His concerns deepened when the camp commander announced the formation of an official prisoner orchestra. Practice space would be provided in an empty storage building. Instruments would be sourced from civilian donations. Performances would be scheduled not just for the camp, but potentially for nearby towns. It seemed excessive, almost bizarre. What military purpose could this possibly serve? "It's a propaganda tool," Tanaka told the others during mealtime. "They'll parade us around like trained monkeys to show how humane they are." Several nodded in agreement, but Nakamura, now first violin in the fledgling orchestra, offered a different perspective. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "or perhaps they simply value music as we do. I've spoken with their conductor, a Lieutenant Miller. Before the war, he taught at a university in New York. The way he discusses Beethoven, it is not the talk of a man using music as a weapon. Tanaka scoffed, but doubt had begun to take root. He had been prepared for torture, for starvation, for forced labor. Nothing in his training had equipped him for kindness or cultural exchange. These were more dangerous than cruelty. They threatened not the body, but the certainties that had sustained him through combat. If Americans were not the savages he had been taught to hate, what else might be untrue? The first formal concert occurred 1 month after their arrival. The Prisoner Orchestra, 12 Japanese musicians supplemented by 5 Americans, performed in the camp's assembly hall. The program included both Western and Japanese compositions. Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, traditional folk songs from Hokkaido, a Gershwin arrangement, and finally, a piece composed by Nakamura himself during captivity. Against his better judgment, Tanaka attended. He sat in the back row, arms crossed, determined to remain unmoved. Yet as the music filled the simple wooden structure, something shifted within him. The precision of his countrymen playing alongside their captors, the respectful silence of the American audience during the Japanese pieces, the spontaneous applause that followed each selection, it all spoke of something beyond politics or war. When Nakamura's composition began, a melancholy piece that somehow captured both the sorrow of defeat and the strange peace of their current circumstances, Tanaka felt his throat tighten. The music articulated emotions he had refused to acknowledge: relief at surviving, confusion about his future, homesickness for a Japan that might no longer exist by war's end. Around him, he noticed other prisoners discreetly wiping their eyes. The Americans in the audience seemed equally moved, though they could not possibly understand the cultural complexities embedded in the music. Their response appeared genuine, not the calculated approval of propagandists. When the piece ended, they stood in applause, a gesture of respect that required no shared language or history. As they filed out of the hall afterward, Sergeant Thomas Hendricks, one of the camp guards, commented to Tanaka in halting Japanese, "Your friend's music, very beautiful, very sad." Tanaka nodded stiffly, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected moment of human connection. He had been trained to see this man as an enemy, not as someone capable of appreciating the same beauty that moved him. It was a small interaction, lasting only seconds, yet it lingered in his mind like a splinter he could not remove. Back in the barracks, debate erupted among the prisoners. Some saw the concert as a triumph, proof that Japanese culture could command respect even in defeat. Others viewed participation as shameful collaboration. Most fell somewhere between, uncertain what to make of this strange captivity, where their jailers applauded their talents.
"In the Imperial Army, we had no time for concerts," said Corporal Matsuda, a hardliner who had initially resisted all American overtures. "We trained, we fought, we sacrificed. These Americans play music while their comrades die in the Pacific. It shows their weakness." "Does it?" countered Nakamura. "They produce more planes, more ships, more bullets than our factories ever could. Yet they still find time for music? Perhaps that is not weakness, but a different kind of strength." The words hung in the air, challenging assumptions that none had dared question before. Tanaka lay awake that night, turning the thought over in his mind. The music program was expanding. The Americans had sourced Japanese instruments for the orchestra, including a shamisen and several taiko drums. Weekly concerts were now scheduled. Civilian music teachers from nearby towns had volunteered to offer instruction.
It seemed an enormous expenditure of resources for prisoners who, by all military logic, should be treated as security risks, not cultural ambassadors. What kind of nation could afford such generosity in the midst of total war? What did it say about American society that even their prison camps had orchestras? These questions led to uncomfortable comparisons with conditions in the Imperial Japanese Army, where music had been limited to martial anthems, where cultural expression was subordinated to military necessity, where resources were so scarce that soldiers sometimes went days without adequate food. The contrast became starker when Red Cross packages arrived containing news from the Pacific Front. American forces were advancing island by island. Japanese cities were being bombed. Resources at home were dwindling. Yet here, behind barbed wire in California, Japanese prisoners ate regular meals, received medical care, and performed concerts with instruments that would have been melted down for the war effort in their homeland. "Sometimes I feel guilty," admitted Private Toshiro Sato during a cigarette break. "My brother fights in the Philippines with half rations, while I play drums for the Americans and eat 3 meals a day. What right do I have to this comfort?" Tanaka understood the sentiment. Prisoner rations, while bland, exceeded what many Japanese civilians received. The camp had reliable electricity when blackouts plagued Tokyo. Clean water flowed freely, while families at home queued for hours at public pumps. These ironies were difficult to reconcile with the sacrificial ethos they had been raised to embody. Yet the music offered something beyond physical comfort, a preservation of humanity that war threatened to destroy. Each note played was an assertion that culture could survive even in captivity, that beauty remained possible even in defeat. Tanaka found himself drawn to the practice sessions, first as an observer, later as a reluctant participant when it was discovered he could play the shakuhachi flute. The first time he joined the orchestra, he felt like a traitor. The second time, it seemed merely unusual. By the third session, something had changed. The music had become a lifeline, connecting him to a self he had almost forgotten during years of military service. The self that had once attended concerts in Tokyo, that had appreciated art before duty consumed everything. As summer turned to autumn, the prisoner orchestra gained skill and repertoire. They performed not only in camp, but under guard at local schools and community centers. American audiences received them with curiosity and surprising warmth. After one such concert, an elderly woman approached Tanaka with tears in her eyes. "My son is fighting in the Pacific," she said through an interpreter. "I pray he is treated as well, if captured, as you are treating us with your beautiful music." The encounter left him shaken. This woman saw him as a person first, an enemy second. It contradicted everything he had been taught about the American people, that they were bloodthirsty, vengeful, incapable of nuance. Here was evidence that they could separate the human from the political, the musician from the soldier. Could the same be said of Japan's treatment of Allied prisoners? He knew the answer, but could not bear to articulate it. Corporal Ichiro Watanabe, who had survived the brutal fighting on Tarawa before capture, expressed what many felt. "If I had known this was what awaited me as a prisoner, I might not have fought so desperately to avoid capture." How many of our comrades died needlessly, believing that surrender meant torture? The question was treasonous by Imperial Army standards, yet increasingly common in barracks conversations. As news filtered in about Japan's deteriorating position in the war, as American bombing raids intensified over the home islands, the contrast between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. They had been prepared for the worst and encountered instead a strange, disorienting humanity. Nothing illustrated this more clearly than the Winter Holiday Concert of 1944. The prisoner orchestra, now 30 members strong, performed alongside American musicians in the camp's newly constructed auditorium. The program featured holiday music from both traditions, European carols and Japanese winter songs. For the finale, they performed Hana, Flower, a folk song beloved throughout Japan, arranged for full orchestra by Lieutenant Miller and Nakamura. The audience of prisoners, guards, and invited civilians listened in perfect silence as the melody unfolded, simple, haunting, evoking cherry blossoms and the impermanence of beauty. When the final notes faded, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. For a moment, the war receded. They were not enemies, but simply humans sharing in music's universal language. After the concert, Captain Williams, the camp commander, made an unprecedented announcement. "In recognition of the orchestra's contribution to camp morale, we're establishing a permanent music room. Additionally, weekly music appreciation classes will be offered to all prisoners who wish to attend." The news spread through the camp like wildfire. A dedicated space for music? Classes in music theory and history? Even conservatory students in pre-war Japan hadn't enjoyed such focused resources. Some prisoners viewed it as further evidence of American excess, others as a meaningful acknowledgement of culture's importance. Most simply marveled at the paradox that in captivity they would receive musical education superior to what had been available to them as free men. For Tanaka, the announcement crystallized a transformation that had been occurring gradually over months. He had arrived expecting brutality and encountered complexity instead. The music program wasn't mere propaganda. It reflected genuine American values about culture's place even during war. This realization was more destabilizing than any hardship could have been. It forced him to reconsider not just his views of the enemy, but of his own society's priorities. The new music room opened in January 1945. A converted storage building, it featured a small stage, practice booths, and an impressive collection of instruments donated by civilians. Soundproofing materials had been installed, an extravagance that astonished the prisoners. Even more surprising was the library of sheet music and theory books, some in Japanese, ordered specifically for the camp. During the opening ceremony, Lieutenant Miller explained the project's purpose. Music transcends the boundaries that divide us. While we remain opponents in this war, we can still recognize each other's humanity through cultural exchange. This room is a space where that recognition can occur daily. The speech was translated for the prisoners, many of whom received it with visible emotion. For men raised in Japan's highly nationalistic education system, the concept that enemies could acknowledge each other's humanity while still fighting was revolutionary. It suggested a separation between political conflict and cultural respect that few had previously considered possible. As Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, as news arrived of devastating bombing raids on Japanese cities, the music room became a sanctuary. Prisoners gathered there not just for organized rehearsals, but for impromptu jam sessions, theory discussions, and silent listening with borrowed records and a phonograph. It was a space where the war momentarily ceased to exist, where they were musicians first and captives second. The effects extended beyond those who actively participated. The entire camp's atmosphere shifted as music became integrated into daily life. Morning bugle calls were supplemented with short concerts during mealtimes. Holidays featured special performances. Even work details moved to the rhythm of hummed melodies. For men who had expected to die either in battle or in captivity, this cultured existence seemed almost dreamlike in its improbability. Sergeant Masayuki Kimura, a former Tokyo police officer, expressed the paradox during a late-night conversation. In Japan, I attended perhaps 3 concerts in my entire life. Tickets were expensive, venues limited to major cities. Music was for the elite. Here, behind American barbed wire, I have heard more classical music in 8 months than in 30 years of freedom. How do I make sense of this? No one had a satisfactory answer. The contradictions piled up, challenging everything they had believed about American society. They had been told Americans were culturally bankrupt, interested only in profit and pleasure. Yet here were American officers who could discuss Bach's cantatas with scholarly precision. They had been taught that Western individualism produced chaos and selfishness. Yet the orchestra demonstrated remarkable collaborative discipline. Most unsettling was the growing awareness that music in the camp reflected something fundamental about American society itself. Its ability to maintain cultural pursuits even during total war. Its belief that quality of life mattered even for enemies. This recognition made it increasingly difficult to sustain the hatred that had fueled them in combat. "I no longer know what victory would mean," confessed Private Takahashi, a young conscript who had been captured on Guam. "If Japan were to somehow win this war, would we treat American prisoners to shakuhachi concerts? Would we build them music rooms? I cannot imagine it." The comment earned him sharp looks from die-hard imperialists, but many nodded silently in agreement. The music program had become a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about both societies. America's surprising cultural depth, and Japan's militaristic suppression of the very arts it claimed to revere. In February 1945, this tension culminated in an unprecedented event. The camp orchestra was invited to perform at a nearby university concert hall. Under heavy guard, but without restraints, 30 Japanese prisoners traveled by bus to present a program of classical and traditional music to a civilian audience. The university's music department had requested the performance specifically to hear authentic Japanese compositions played by trained musicians. For Tanaka, now the orchestra's shakuhachi soloist, the experience was surreal. He stood on a professional stage, bright lights warming his face, a sea of American faces watching with respect and curiosity. As he played a traditional piece called Honshirabe, the pure tones of his bamboo flute filling the hushed auditorium, he experienced a moment of perfect clarity. These people, the supposed enemies, were listening to centuries-old Japanese music with the same reverence they would give to their own cultural traditions. They applauded not out of politeness, but genuine appreciation. How could he reconcile this respect with the dehumanizing propaganda that had portrayed Americans as cultural barbarians? How could he maintain hatred for people who valued his artistic expression? After the concert, music professors approached the Japanese musicians with technical questions about instruments and performance practices. Students requested autographs. A local newspaper photographer took pictures not as curiosities, but as visiting artists. For a few hours, their status as enemy prisoners receded, and they existed primarily as cultural ambassadors. On the bus ride back to camp, silence reigned. The experience had been too profound, too contradictory to process immediately. They had left as prisoners and somehow returned as something more complex, representatives of a cultural tradition respected even by those fighting against their nation. The next morning's news devastated any lingering sense of unreality. Radio reports announced massive firebombing of Tokyo. Early estimates suggested tens of thousands dead, entire districts reduced to ash. The prisoners gathered around the camp's bulletin board where translations were posted, searching for details about neighborhoods where family might live. Nakamura discovered his family's district had been targeted. Whether they had survived remained unknown. He did not appear for that day's rehearsal, nor the next. When he finally returned to the music room, his playing had changed. More raw, more anguished, yet somehow more profound. His suffering, channeled through his violin, created music of startling emotional power. The American musicians responded not with awkwardness, but with respectful adaptation, altering their own playing to support and complement his changed style. The musical conversation that emerged transcended the bombing, the imprisonment, even the war itself. It was human grief met with human compassion, expressed through a medium that required no words. Captain Williams, after observing one such rehearsal, implemented a policy change that stunned the prisoners. The camp would observe 5 minutes of silence before each concert to acknowledge losses on both sides of the conflict. This recognition that Japanese civilian deaths deserved the same respect as American military casualties contradicted every assumption about how enemies should view one another. How can they bomb our cities and mourn our dead simultaneously? Asked a bewildered Corporal Sato during mess hall discussions. It makes no sense. Perhaps that is the difference, replied Tanaka, who had been grappling with similar questions. They see the contradiction and acknowledge it. They separate the strategic necessity from the human cost. In our training, we were taught that the enemy had no humanity worth respecting. As spring arrived, news from the Pacific grew increasingly grim for Japan. Iwo Jima had fallen. Okinawa was under assault. B-29s bombed the home islands daily. Yet in the camp, the music program expanded further. A small recording device was acquired, allowing the orchestra to create records of their performances. Music theory classes were supplemented with composition workshops. A camp choir formed to complement the instrumental groups. This cultural flourishing amidst Japan's military collapse created cognitive dissonance that few could resolve. They were receiving musical education while their homeland burned. They performed concerts while fellow soldiers died by the thousands. Was this a betrayal of their national duty, or the preservation of something that would survive long after the war ended? For Tanaka, the question became personal when he was asked to teach shakuhachi techniques to interested American musicians. Would sharing this traditional Japanese art form constitute disloyalty to his country? Or would refusing the cultural exchange demonstrate the very kind of narrow thinking that had led to war? After days of consideration, he agreed to teach. His first class included 3 American guards and Lieutenant Miller. They sat cross-legged on the music room floor, awkwardly holding the bamboo flutes, struggling with the unfamiliar embouchure. Their genuine interest and respectful attention to his instructions slowly dissolved his remaining reservations. In Japan, he explained, demonstrating the proper breathing technique, shakuhachi was played by Zen monks as a form of meditation. Each note is a universe. The space between notes matters as much as the sound itself. The Americans nodded, attempting to follow his guidance. Their initial attempts produced wavering, uncertain tones, yet they persisted with remarkable patience. It struck Tanaka that these men, who could have spent their off-duty hours anywhere else, chose to sit on a hard floor learning an ancient Japanese instrument from a prisoner of war. What did that reveal about their culture? About humanity's capacity to connect across seemingly unbridgeable divides? As the lesson progressed, Tanaka found himself speaking not just about technique, but about the philosophical underpinnings of traditional Japanese music, concepts of ma, space, and wa, harmony, that had shaped artistic expression for centuries. The Americans listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that indicated genuine curiosity about a worldview different from their own. By the lesson's end, something had shifted in Tanaka's perception. He was no longer simply a prisoner teaching captors, but a cultural representative sharing valuable knowledge. The exchange felt mutually respectful, almost equal, despite the power imbalance inherent in their situation. It was as if the music had created a small territory where the war temporarily ceased to exist. This sense of unlikely equilibrium culminated in June 1945, when the camp orchestra performed its most ambitious program yet, a joint concert featuring both traditional Japanese music and American jazz. The stage was split between Tanaka's traditional ensemble and an American swing band led by Sergeant Ray Johnson, a former professional trumpeter from New Orleans. The evening began with separate performances. Tanaka's group playing classical Japanese pieces, Johnson's band delivering energetic renditions of Duke Ellington and Count Basie standards. The audience of prisoners and guards responded enthusiastically to both, applauding with equal vigor for shakuhachi solos and trumpet improvisations. Then came the experiment that had required weeks of rehearsal, a fusion piece composed collaboratively by Tanaka and Johnson, merging Japanese pentatonic scales with jazz harmonies, traditional instruments with Western drum kit and brass. The result was entirely new, neither fully Japanese nor American, but something that could not have existed without both traditions. As they performed this hybrid creation, Tanaka experienced a moment of profound realization. Here, in a prison camp during humanity's most destructive war, he was participating in genuine cultural innovation. The music they created represented not defeat or victory, but the possibility of synthesis, of finding common ground without erasing difference. The audience's reaction suggested they sensed the significance too. The applause lasted several minutes, with both prisoners and guards standing in appreciation. Captain Williams, typically reserved, approached the musicians afterward with visible emotion. "Gentlemen, what you've created here transcends this camp, this war. It reminds us what remains possible even in the darkest times." That night, lying on his bunk, Tanaka reflected on the journey from his capture to this moment. He had arrived expecting torture, prepared to die rather than collaborate. Instead, he had found himself teaching shakuhachi to Americans, composing fusion music, experiencing cultural exchange more meaningful than any he had known as a free man in Japan. The paradox was impossible to resolve within the militaristic framework he had been taught. By imperial standards, he should feel shame for these activities, yet the music had reconnected him with aspects of humanity that war had nearly extinguished: creativity, beauty, the capacity to find common ground with supposed enemies. Was this surrender or salvation? He could no longer tell. August brought news that transformed everything. Atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Soviet entry into the war. Japan's surrender. The prisoners gathered around radio broadcasts, struggling to comprehend the scale of destruction, the technological leap the weapons represented, the sudden end of a conflict many had expected to continue for years. In the stunned silence that followed Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement, it was the orchestra members who recovered first. Without formal planning, they gathered in the music room, instruments in hand. No words were exchanged. None seemed adequate to the moment. Instead, they began to play. The music they created that day was like nothing heard before in the camp. Not a rehearsed piece, but a spontaneous lamentation. Traditional Japanese instruments wailed alongside Western strings. Percussion marked time like a funeral procession. Wind instruments called and responded like voices in conversation. For hours they played, prisoners and guards alike joining when moved to do so, creating a sonic memorial to all that had been lost. Captain Williams allowed the impromptu concert to continue past curfew, understanding instinctively that the music provided something no words could offer, a channel for grief, confusion, relief, and uncertainty about the future. When they finally finished, exhausted and emotionally spent, the silence that followed felt cleansed, almost sacred. In the days that followed, as details emerged about the atomic devastation and arrangements began for the prisoners' eventual repatriation, the orchestra continued its regular schedule. The music now carried new meaning. No longer a surprising luxury of captivity, but a bridge to whatever post-war world awaited them. During one of the final rehearsals, Lieutenant Miller addressed the Japanese musicians. "Many of you will return to a Japan very different from the one you left.
Cities destroyed, political systems transformed, foreign occupation. Music may seem unimportant amidst such challenges, but what we've created here, this cultural conversation, offers a model for rebuilding, not through dominance, but through exchange, respect for tradition, alongside openness to innovation." The words resonated deeply with Tanaka, who had been contemplating his own uncertain future. What place would there be in defeated Japan for a former officer who had experienced the enemy's humanity, who had taught Americans to play shakuhachi, who had composed music that merged cultural traditions? Would such experiences be valued or condemned as collaboration? As repatriation approached, the camp organized one final concert, a farewell performance open to local civilians as well as military personnel. The program included pieces from the orchestra's entire repertoire, from Mozart to traditional Japanese compositions to the jazz fusion experiments they had pioneered.
For Tanaka, now conducting the traditional ensemble, it represented both culmination and closure. Before the music began, he addressed the audience, speaking through an interpreter. "When I arrived at this camp, I expected only suffering and death. I found instead something I had forgotten existed, the universal language of music. While our nations fought, we created harmony. This paradox contains wisdom I will carry home, whatever awaits me there." The performance that followed was perhaps their finest, technically precise yet emotionally profound. As Tanaka played his final shakuhachi solo, he looked out at the audience of Americans and Japanese, enemies by political circumstance, united momentarily by cultural appreciation. In that moment, he glimpsed possibilities for the post-war world that transcended victor and vanquished. The repatriation process began in October 1945. As prisoners packed their meager belongings, many discovered gifts from their American musical counterparts, sheet music, instruction books, even small instruments they were permitted to take home. Lieutenant Miller presented Tanaka with a hand-carved shakuhachi flute inscribed with both their names, a gesture that moved the Japanese officer to uncharacteristic tears. Before boarding the transport ships, the musicians gathered one last time in the now empty music room. No instruments remained, yet the space still held the echo of countless rehearsals, lessons, and performances. Nakamura broke the contemplative silence. "Whatever Japan becomes after this defeat, I will find ways to continue what began here. Music that bridges cultures, that speaks when words fail." Others nodded in agreement. They had arrived as imperial soldiers, certain of their superiority, prepared for martyrdom. They departed as musicians who had experienced the complexity of human connection across enemy lines.
The transformation could not be undone, regardless of how they might be received in occupied Japan. As their ship pulled away from American shores, Tanaka stood at the rail, the gifted shakuhachi secure in his pack. The California coastline receded, taking with it the prison camp that had defied every expectation. He had been captured expecting the worst of humanity. He returned home having glimpsed its better possibilities through the most unlikely of means, an orchestra behind barbed wire. Years later, when asked about his wartime experiences, Tanaka would often fall silent, unable to convey the paradox to those who had not lived it. How could he explain that his humanity had been most fully recognized not by his own military, but by his captors? That music had flourished not in freedom, but in confinement? That he had discovered cultural innovation not in victory, but in defeat?
Instead, he would simply take out his shakuhachi, the one inscribed with two names, one Japanese, one American, and play a piece composed in that camp orchestra. The notes carried what words could not: the possibility that even across the chasm of war, humans might recognize in each other a shared capacity for beauty. It was, perhaps, the only war story worth preserving, as the world rebuilt from ashes. A reminder that beneath the divisions we create lie connections waiting to be discovered, if only we have the courage to listen. What unexpected discoveries have you made about supposed enemies? What roles might art and music play in helping us recognize our shared humanity during times of conflict? Perhaps in these quiet moments of connection across seemingly unbridgeable divides, we glimpse what peace truly requires of us all.